So let's get into it. First of all, Chris and I were intending to sit down and have a chat today about, the Meta antitrust trial. We're at the end of the first week, and we will talk a bit about that. But as we predicted 2 weeks ago on this show, the judge in the Google antitrust trial, the third of the Google antitrust trials, dropped her verdict today. And it's a cut and paste job because we've got Google case number 1, guilty, Google case number 2, guilty, and Google case number 3, guilty. So I love the line that the Department of Justice lawyer gave in his headline, in his parting statement. He said the way this is going to end is with Google being once, twice, 3 times a monopolist, and that's what's happened. And so the short of this is that Google was prosecuted for being a monopolist in the App Store and charging super high fees, 30%, for people that lived in the App Store. It was a $46 billion business unit for Google. Google lost that case. As a result, it's now being pressured to drop its pricing and make lots and lots of changes in the App Store. The big one was, okay, we're now going to go after Google for being a monopolist in search, and that no one else can build good search products. Google owns that space. And that was touch and go. And were they going to win? Weren't they going to win? It was a brilliantly fought case. Both sides did a brilliant job. In fact, the judge at the end of it said, this is the best fought case I've ever seen. It was really good. But Google lost that one as well, okay, which led to the calls to break it up and sell off Chrome and various other bits and pieces. This third one went after the money. This one was about, okay, is Google's ad tech that sits off the side of, the Google product, if you like, was that also a monopoly? Were people pressured so much that it was the only product you could use for ad serving, Google Ad Manager, and for ad supply, AdX, and data, Google Analytics? Yep. Was this the only place you could get all of that? And we've waited and we've waited and we've waited, and boom, this morning, Judge Brinkema steps in, Leonie Brinkema steps in and goes, yes, it is. And so that is going to rewrite the story for everyone. And do you know what my first reaction was after I did a little jig at 5 o'clock this morning when my email started ringing? Was that everyone then said, oh no, well, what now? What now? So in your world, we were on a call just last night, you and I, about this. What now for publishers, man? You've been there more recently than me. What now for them?
It's so funny because the thing we were talking about, which I think a lot of people will feel, is this is almost in the same week you've got both Meta and Google, and this is for me this is the big one. The AdX kind of the background of how ads are traded was always the thing that has consumed more and more of the revenue. So actually, when you talk to publishers and you say, like, what would you do if? It's almost like I say, what would you do if the sky was green and gravity didn't exist and cars were made of jelly and whatever? And it's just, these are just things that people have never seen. They've never really had to think through what it might mean. And so this is, potentially a genuinely competitive market for search, leading to a genuinely competitive market for ad exchanges. It is a revolution.
It's a total revolution.
It's a total revolution. And the cases could not be more clear that this is not about fines. I think particularly in the Google case. Meta might turn out a different way, but the Google one is so clear that this is not about fines. One of the other things in the judgment was I can't get the bloody Lionel Richie song out of my head. The once, twice, 3 times.
Once, twice. I know. It's been getting
3
it for
times
weeks.
a monopolist.
That's it. It doesn't go so well, does it?
But they're very clear also in there that they were scathing about Google's kind of evidence handling and how they withheld evidence, how they tried to destroy the kind of trails of emails and things that were in there. And so there's a big question about conduct as well, which again doesn't tend to lead to fines as punishment. It tends to lead to structural changes. So the whole structure,
or jail, depending on whether there was malice in doing so. Right, it's called spoliation, right? And so I think that's going to be absolutely fascinating. There's a trial already listed for that.
And did they said in the judgment, didn't they, that almost we didn't miss the fact that you did that, but because we're going to find you guilty for the violation of the Sherman Act, which is a great phrase, but because we're going to find you guilty of that, we'll come back to that later.
They said that. They said that in the second ruling as well. So when Judge Amit Mehta gave his ruling on the search antitrust trial, he basically said, look, this is outrageous. And it sets a really, really dangerous precedent when a company as big and as kind of influential as Google does it. It sets an agenda for everybody else, and we can't allow that to stand. But he said, at the end of the day, I'll find you guilty of absolutely everything else, and the penalties that I'm going to issue for that is going to fix this. So I think if you're in the legal team at at Google, you've probably had a pretty good run for the last year or 18 months. I reckon you've been pretty busy on your $2,000 a day they were getting US, by the way, the lawyers. So a lot of Louboutin heels being worn in the court case. And, the upshot from that was, but you know what? I think that, there's some of these people are going to get in some real serious trouble now because Google's lawyers advised and trained the staff in Google to use a chat app that automatically deleted every 24 hours while under an evidence hold. And an evidence hold, and you've been under one, I've been under one, basically says, don't delete anything because we're going to use that as evidence. And if you then go ahead and delete it after you've been told that stinks.
Yeah. So structurally, you would think they haven't got to that bit yet, and we're in sort of remedies this week around search, and that, as you said, comes back to you have to sell Chrome. You can't do the deal with Apple. So these are like big structural remedies. You'd think in the ad case, so, in simple terms, Google owns the supply side and the demand side of digital advertising.
And the measurement side,
and the measurement. I mean, it's a nice position to be in. Structurally, you're talking about having to divest, I guess, at least one of those three. Potentially, I don't think all three, but potentially 2 out of 3.
I think they lose 2, and I think third one doesn't matter. So my prediction is that I think Google Ad Manager is now is such the market standard for this kind of stuff. I think at the trial it was said that 4 in 5 publishers used it. About 85% of advertisers used it. Everybody from large brands all the way down to mums and dads, and every single global advertising holding group used it. And so if you add all that together, that's a market share in the high 80s, right? And so it's a utility, it's not a tool, and you can't really charge 36 cents on the dollar, which is what they were charging to use it when it's a utility. Okay, if we got charged for air, that would be a really big problem. It's like the Lorax movie, you remember, and the guy's trying to sell you bottles of air. It's the same thing, right? You can't really do that. It looks awfully like a monopoly, right? And so I think that they lose GAM, and I think GAM probably, one of the remedies that's being sought is that GAM becomes free for everybody to use without any charges against it. That's the first thing. The second thing, you're exactly right, is the ad supply. So everybody's desperate for these ads to come down the pipe. They've got the pipe in GAM, but they need ads to come down the pipe because most publishers aren't selling anymore. And so the second remedy that's being demanded is that all of that ad supply has to be made available to everybody, and for no fee. And so that is also a massive thing. The third one, though, the measurement piece, that almost you have to have that for the other two to work because you can't receive an ad and serve an ad and not measure it. So I think the third one just comes rolled into the bargain. It's like 3 for 1. It's like the best. It's the best bargain you've ever got from Google, which it is by some considerable distance.
But if you go back to, so we're talking today 350 billion of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
How much would you think sits in those two kind of that ad exchange world? I mean, it's huge, right? It's
just under 300. So it's ever so slightly under 300 of that 350. Yeah. Billion.
So we could be talking. Let's say, because Google won't, they won't disappear. They're not going to shut Google down. But let's say they lose 30% of that share. It's 100 billion.
Yeah. Well, let's do the maths on that. So if it's 300 billion a year, okay, that's 800 million a day. Okay. So, you are up in the ludicrous numbers, mind-blowing numbers. And I think that, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the impact this is going to have on Google and the impact it's going to have on Google's competitors who've not been able to get a whiff of fresh air for years. I saw there all over the stock market, there was green all over the stock market today, all in alternative DSPs. They were just whoosh to the moon.
I'll tell you, the green area that is not going to do well out of this is Ireland, by the way. which has just probably lost, which has lost most of its tax base this week between Meta and Google.
That's right. So you're saying if I'm going to be doing some property speculation, I should do it over there. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. The Malahide in Dublin, whatever the fancy parts of Dublin is the place to buy this week.
They rang me once, the city of Dublin. They wanted to me to attend an event and speak at it, and I said, okay, what I'd really like to talk about is this tax regimen. Like, hello. That was it.
Yeah.
But so if you're a publisher, right, and you've been working in the sales team of that publisher for anything less than 20 years, you don't know any other flavor other than Google, do you?
No.
And you believe...
You might have the odd. So you might have the odd relationship. I guess you might have a relationship with Ozone, which again is a big beneficiary of decisions like this.
Only in the UK.
Yeah, only in the UK. You might have kind of nurtured. I mean, this is the beauty of it. I think you might have a relationship with Bing. You might have a relationship with Ozone. You might have done some things, but they're all fringes at the moment, and they're all sort of almost things you do just to find out. They're experiments, but they can't roll out because Google dominates each of those areas to such an extent. So now you're in a position where, as publishers, I think you start to say, right, genuinely, have we got runners and riders? You know, if there is a kind of carve up of the search from iOS, you know, from iPhone traffic, and there is a kind of carve up of the both the supply and demand side of the markets, who are going to be the winners out of that? Which of those winners, and for competition reasons, we should be very careful to say this is not a collusion, but which of those winners are likely to offer favourable terms to publishers? Which are going to do the things that Google has consistently kind of moved away from doing as it's become more and more powerful and kind of hungry for margin?
Isn't this the most perfect post-monopoly decision analysis? So what we're actually discussing is, how are we going to start to work within a market that's actually competitive? That's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, oh, hang on, I don't recognize that idea whatsoever. It's like, what? How corrupt have we become in our understanding of how this market works? Look, at the end of the day, we've talked a lot. We talked about it last week, and we've talked about it a lot on these calls in the past couple of weeks, is that there's a real opportunity for the news industry to king make the winner here. Right. Yes. So I would love to think that the publishing industry could all work collaboratively to try and create an ad server that we all got behind, and then we could all set our own prices and our own measurement, and we could basically say, if you want to buy these 4 billion people over here, this is the only place to buy it. Because the way it's been, hasn't it? It's been that you guys buy Google, you buy Meta, or you buy rats and mice, and everybody buys Google and Meta because it's got no difficulty. It's really simple to do that. It's well greased. The publishing industry should have built this product at the same time years and years ago, but it didn't. I noticed that TikTok, when we were talking about TikTok about 5-6 weeks ago, we were talking about how it had invested in building an ad tech platform. It's just gone from $1 billion to $4 billion in revenue in 1 year, right? And TikTok doesn't have any more traffic or audience than all the publishers added together. So this money could come to publishing, but it would require us to herd the cats, or require the publishing industry to herd the cats. And I think we all think that's hard. So I guess my feedback to you is that there's an opportunity to king make someone here. The publishing industry could collectively go to one alternate platform and say, hey, we will king make you and give you the volume, the quality, the data, the analytics, the audience, the measurement, everything that you want. You can use our names on all of your documentation, everything else. But guess what? CPM never drops below $35 ever on anything. Well, and we want 50% of the company, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's one is to take an ownership position. The second one is to genuinely treat like a competitive market. And you know, so one of the things that hasn't been possible in the last, you don't work with Google at the moment as a publisher and say, right, what are the terms for the next 12 months? And can you give us a bigger deal? Can you get us a better deal? So there's this ability to say, well, actually, we're going to work with these guys, and 412, we have the ability to move contracts around because the market is freed up. You know, so we have some leverage on who we choose to supply and who we choose for demand.
Put it out for tender.
Yeah, we have leverage on what our price floors are. We're going to get an awful lot more visibility of pricing. As soon as this becomes an actual competitive market, you're going to get an awful lot more visibility on what pricing is and what it's for. And I can't overstate how in some ways, it's always a bit of a dichotomy of the ad market in that there is so much information about all of the things that are going on and all of the complexity that's there. But actually, the bit that you really want, which is what's the price that I could have got, had this been a fair fight, has never been available because it sits somewhere in Mountain View being danced around by Scrooge McDuck. So,
but not for much longer. Scrooge McDuck, by the way, is dead. And this is great, and it's kind of Scrooge McFucked these days. Go ahead.
How long do you think? So we've seen with the other Google case, we got the judgment before Christmas. We're in remedies now. It might come out to end of remedies, June, July. Then it might go to appeal. So you might get to kind of remedies. Let's say Christmas, maybe.
Yeah, I think we'll have a pretty fair idea on what those remedies are fairly soon. I actually think it's in Google's best interest actually to try and get to the remedies sooner rather than later. So, I'm not breaching any confidences here if I say that 3 publishers have rung me today, and all of them have had a phone call from Google today, saying that they want their GAM contracts are coming up for renewal and they need to renew them, and they only have till Friday to renew them, Friday next week to renew them. Oh, and by the way, the price is going down. Like, oh no shit. And so the product that's about to be free, they're desperately trying to sign people up for another 2-3 years before next Friday, by the way. So you haven't got time to read any of this stuff. We need to get it done. Isn't that interesting? So
that's amazing.
It's not.
Or what? We're going to turn GAM off.
Well, this is the point. Yeah, and this is a really interesting one of those. There's a great line from the judge, the first judge in the App Store. He basically said the future is not going to be like the past, and we're not interested in issuing fines. What we're doing is we're breaking everything, and there's going to be a period of chaos, and it's going to be really scary, and the future isn't going to be the one that you've known, and it's going to take a while for the dust to settle. But we can't change the future unless we stop the past, and that's what we have to do. That is literally what's playing out here, isn't it? It's literally.
Yeah.
Imagine if you don't want to renew for 3 years because it might be free in 8 months. And at the same time, you don't want to lose all your advertising on the 31st of April, right?
Yeah.
There's only 30 days in April. On the 30th of April, right? And so you are in this massive dichotomy. I agree. And I didn't have an answer for the publishers that were ringing me for help today other than say, look, you're going to have to talk to your Google guy on Tuesday, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny, let's not underestimate, the complexity, the operational complexity of what's already in place. It's not like any publisher can spin that up before next week. They can move around kind of demand and supply a little bit, but the sort of the industrial machine that runs advertising is Google. So
that's why the remedy concept of making GAM free to everyone is a really good outcome because it requires no new plumbing and the water's free. Yeah. So I actually think that's a really elegant solution. It makes sense. It is a public service.
Yeah, I think my advice to anyone signing contracts now would be that you put a clause in, you insist on a clause in there that says, so what we can't be involved in here is illegal activity. So I would put in a kind of protection clause that any judgment that changes the commercial nature of this deal, allows us to revisit. So you've got in contracts all the time, you have a change of control kind of clause that says, or if the company that you're contracting with gets bought out or their ownership changes or something significant behind the scenes changes, then we get to revisit the terms of this contract.
Is this a least favoured nations clause? Is that kind of what this is?
Basically.
Yeah, we like you so little. But what we'd like you to do is to guarantee we pay nothing if you get broken up.
Man, it's a bad behaviour clause, isn't it? It's a kind of let's not pretend that you're not in court clause. And so trying to sign a deal, trying to be coerced into signing it. I mean, in some ways, it's quite a bold move. If you say, well, we've just been caught kind of 3 times a coercive monopolist, and what we're going to do now is we're going to insist that everybody signs 3-year deals. Using our powers. Hang on a minute.
You know what I heard though when I heard that today was that this is where I almost have some sympathy for Google. And when I say almost, look, I'm at pains not to have sympathy for Google, to be honest. But I almost have some sympathy for them because it's very limited what Google can actually do in this scenario. Because if you're a senior exec in the C-suite, You report directly to the shareholders, right? You think that you build a search engine or an ad product. You don't do any of those things. And the company hasn't done that for the best part of 15 years. What it does is it makes money for shareholders and it drives the S&P or the NASDAQ, right? That's what it does. That's its job. Hey, Dennis. And that is its entire raison d'etre. And so when you find yourself in this situation, the reason that Google's reached this point is because it's done too good a job of helping its shareholders. And now the shareholders are going to be saying, well, hang on a minute, I've got $150, $200 million sitting in this company, and I don't want that to go down by 15% next quarter, and I certainly don't want it to go to nothing. So I want you to extract as much money as you can until the very last minute, at which point we can then decide to take our money where we decide to take it. And so I think that, the reason, I would imagine an edict has gone out from Mountain View saying to every single salesperson in the country, going, anybody that's got a renewal coming up anytime in the next 9 months, give them 10 days.
Yeah.
Because they want to lock in earnings for as long as they
Well,
can.
exactly. Because we've seen this in so many places where, you can be dying for a long time quite profitably. We talked about this before, that we're past a peak, but you can have a long, fairly lucrative career. I mean, I suppose Google is amusingly now in the position that kind of publishers will be very familiar with. So we're here for tea and sympathy, which is you now have a legacy business, which is clearly in decline, and you need your new digital business. I think it's called AI, to become sort of the revenue and profit driver before you run out of money from your previous monopoly. So, yeah. Well, I think that's it. What happened to the share price yesterday?
For Google, it went down about 4%, not massively, but then, to be honest, in every other antitrust trial, there's been a period of shock. And we also are going into a holiday weekend. And so I think that people have decided not to go, they've got 4 days to see how the dust settles a little bit. I mean, the actual timing of this is actually fairly good if you're an investor. I'm sure that wasn't a complete accident either.
No.
And so, there's a little bit of time to see what happens. Google might be working on a big announcement. See, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Google doesn't proactively spin off some parts of this business now, rather than have them chiseled off. It's just a better look, if it's trying to maintain some kind of longevity. So, for example, if I was thinking, all right, well, what do I chisel off? I'd probably give away at this point GAM. I'd probably say, look, I'm not interested in doing third-party ad sales. You can already see that it's been diminishing that business. It's not interested in selling ads for anyone else. We just don't care. As long as we can continue to use our ad server and our ad supply for our own search business, I'm cool with that, right? So I think that they might just give it up, just hand it over. The big question has been, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, my first question is, do you think they'll appeal?
I think they have to, for the same reason I just mentioned about the shareholders. I think they have no choice but to appeal. If they didn't appeal and the company went down really fast, the shareholders would kill them for it. Yeah. So I think they have to appeal. I think that's I suppose, I haven't, as you said, I think this morning, it's a very big document. So there's 150 pages or whatever that we've got to chew through now to have a look at it. Right. The question, I suppose, is with an appeal, you can't just appeal on the kind of, what's the line from A Few Good Men? I strenuously object. I don't like it, basically. You have to have a reason to appeal. So it'll be interesting to go back through those documents and just work out, from what Google's already said, where exactly are they going to have any kind of grounds for appeal? Because you can't just put an appeal in, where you haven't got a leg to stand on. That's not how. That's a great point. So Google's, my surprise with the whole way Google tackled this entire debacle, because it was an asteroid that you saw like 12 years ago coming. They had plenty of time to prepare.
Yeah.
And their main argument that they put all of their effort behind was, we're not a monopolist because search doesn't exist. General search is not a thing. Yeah. Like there are loads and loads of different jazz hands. And it's like there's loads of search engines, right? What about YouTube? And you go like, well, you own that as well, you idiot, right? Yeah. I couldn't believe they said that. And then it was like, well, what about there's search on Amazon? And I'm like, well, if I go and search on Amazon, can you tell me the weight of a blue whale, please? I'm not going to get very far. So I'm not really sure that counts. And then what about Reddit? And what about everybody? Everybody's got a search engine. Yelp. They kept using Yelp.
Yeah.
Poor Yelp must have been sat there thinking, what have we done? And so you're kind of watching.
Probably happy to be in the news.
Yeah, maybe. Look at our traffic. And then And then when they lost that argument, when the judge literally dismissed it out of hand and just basically went, no, it exists, like search is an actual thing, and you've got 91.5% of it, they kind of rolled over. And I remember thinking at the time, if they lose that, this is going to be a stroll in from here, right? They're going to really struggle to argue that 91.47% share isn't monopolistic. And barrier to entry, it's $4 billion a month to operate the search engine. That feels like a barrier to entry. There aren't many people that can join. So if they lost that first fight, they were on super thin ice. And they just they didn't just lose it. I mean, it was kind of dismissed as a kind of waft of the hand. It's like, I'm not interested in that. That's ridiculous. Let's drop that and move on. So I'm with you, actually. I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. I don't know what the appeal goes after.
No, and it's also been one other notable thing about this one. It's been really quick. So this was I think Jan 23 or something. This launched. So in
the rocket docket.
This is a sprinter. This is a one of the fastest kind of cases that we've seen for one of the biggest amounts of money.
100%. Without doubt, the biggest and the fastest.
Yeah, so we'd be really interested. The other thing about appealing is, I mean, I'm probably with you. I think they probably will. I'm just interested to see sort of how. The other thing that we were all a bit nervous about, I think, was that both the Meta case and the Google case would end up in the kind of in the Oval Office, with the art of the deal, kind of, well, maybe, hey, maybe there's a settlement here, kind of deal.
Who was that?
That was an Italian accent.
That was an Italian accent.
No, just kind of, would it end up with, well, hang on, you could pay a huge fine, or you can do something to help the kind of, and the statements yesterday from Pam Bondi and from all of the different parts of the DOJ were very much, this is where this is heading. So
we again, mate, we were well ahead of the curve on this. So when people were saying to me, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, when people were saying to me and saying to you, there's no way this will go through, the White House will do a deal, they'll bail them out, they can't afford this to happen. It was tone deaf to what the White House under Trump 1 and Trump 2 have been saying all along, which is that, well, these companies have the ability to control total freedom of speech in America. And in Biden's White House, that meant we have to create fair markets and competition and drive share market growth and drive the GDP of the country. A little bit of fairness, a little bit of money. Get that? Over here at the Trump White House, though, they're saying, hang on a minute, there's 50 times as many people go to Google every day as voted me into power, and they can turn off my narrative in a heartbeat. And when we did our chat 2 weeks ago, I think it was, about Google turning off half of Europe's publishers in a trial to see if news was worth anything, I said to you then, I guarantee to you that someone in the White House has gone, hey, Donald, have you heard about this? They've turned off all free speech in Europe with the flip of a switch. And so Pam Bondi's comment was, the first thing she talked about was, this is about creating competition in the markets, and this is what antitrust is for. And then it was freedom of speech, politics, fairness. And then it went to the head of the antitrust unit, and it was fairness, politics, freedom of speech, politics, fairness. And so whichever side you were with, in whichever era you were in, they were committed to breaking this company up.
Yeah, and actually, when you sort of you take those two things and you think, well, what was the actual judgment of the case about? The actual judgment of the case was about a monopolistic position in the demand and supply side of digital advertising and control of the real-time bidding auction. An area where I do not think the trading teams talk a lot about, are we doing the right thing for free speech here?
Deeply worried about the Constitution.
Yeah. Are we giving people? Are there plural voices winning the auction? It's not. So exactly to your point. This is about power as much as it's about freedom of choice in the ad market, and those two things have collided both, I think, in this trial and in the Meta trial. And so, what in some ways you have. So this it's funny. I was when I saw this yesterday. Right, I'm kind of like, oh, thank God, this is the right decision, but it has been a long time coming. And I think part of the frustration that definitely publishers have felt the last 5, 10 years is, when they announce these things, they say, "Hey, turns out Google has a monopoly in advertising." And I was like, "You fucking think?" They've known it for a long time, but Google and Meta have done a very good job at influencing, legislators and governments and doing an awful lot of other things to stay in favor. And that has meant that the power question was, to the detriment of the freedom of these markets. And that's definitely shifted. That's shifted.
Yeah.
And that means that all of these questions, which this is exactly a case that could have been put, they bought Google bought DoubleClick 2007. It was pretty obvious they had both sides of the market by 2012. So they've been, by 2015, publishers were sort of screaming about this. So this is 10 years of a monopoly. Could have happened at any single point in that 10 years. None of the facts of this case have changed. What's changed is the weather above it.
Yeah,
so,
you are totally right. And so I can see Lizzie's just joined. So Lizzie, I won't out you on air, but knows an awful lot about this. Okay, and so when I always thought it was 2004, the first time I mentioned antitrust to the executive of News Corp. And it was a crickets moment. It was like, sorry, what are you talking about, right? And then I was utterly convinced, probably 12, 13 years ago, probably, that this was inevitably going to end up in an antitrust court. It had to, because these companies were growing without any effort. They were growing without any competition. And their kind of dynamics of the audience grows, the revenue grows. The revenue grows, we spend more on the audience, and the audience grows. And eventually, it was just going to all add up to everyone. Yeah. Well, how many companies do you know that have a 91.47% share of the global market?
There's not many.
Yeah. So, that would be a short list in history, right?
Yeah.
And so, maybe Genghis Khan and murder. But other than that, probably nothing ever. And so, the whole point of having the checks and balances of antitrust law in place was to stop this a decade ago. So it never got to this stage where, when it gets turned off, it disrupts 75% of the global economy. But that's really kind of or 75% of the digital economy. That's what we're creating. So what's the point of having the law and the checks and balances if you choose not to use it, right? And I think that the history books will tell the story of the fact that this was really a huge failure to use the tools that were already in place and ready to be used. Because how was it not a monopoly then, right?
Well, so this was nearly taken up. I think I've told you before. I always recommend this book, The Wolves of K Street, which talks about lobbyists in and that goes through in some detail about how this exact case, kind of came up to the Obama administration. But at the same time, Google had done an incredible amount of work with that administration, in the election campaigns and around government. And at the time, were kind of seen as more of a benefit than they were so actually that case in the end went away. So that was in 2008 to 2000 and must have been 2012. So exactly the period we talked about. And it sort of had its moment, didn't get taken up, and then 10 years later, you're kind of you're seeing it come back. So,
Obama said in an interview, I'm going to get it wrong, it was either Business Week or New Statesman or somebody like that, and he basically said his greatest regret of his time as the president was not reigning in big tech, because it had worked really well for him to get him elected, and then he failed to realize just the actual damage it was representing to the American ecosystem that was then effectively poisoning the global ecosystem around digital and advertising. Hey, for everybody that's on the line, by the way, if you want to ask a question, feel free to just type it into the chat box there. We'll do our best to answer it.
And happy Easter to you all too. Thank you for joining us on this Good Friday.
Happy Easter. Happy Easter.
Do you want to go to the global point for a sec? So, this is sort of one jurisdiction. It's obviously the biggest market. It's the home market. So this is the big importance here is that this is kind of the heartland that is making this decision. But all of these cases also exist in the EU. There are cases here in the UK. So the search case that's in remedies at the moment, also the DMU in the UK has said, as the regulators now do, they go, do you know what? We also think that there might be a monopoly in search.
Yeah,
And
Canada,
so Canada's doing
Canada,
the same.
Australia's on the cusp. We're just about to do it.
And one of the things, again, this sort of question about the change in the weather is one of the things that's probably held back, genuine kind of investigations from each of the individual regulators around the world, is that if you didn't get to the American courts, you would never be able to kind of come up with these big structural remedies. So you could, as we talked about recently, you can stop them operating in your territory, but it's quite difficult to do, and it isn't as effective as actually, the sort of root and branch changes that we might get now. So I would expect to also see the kind of an acceleration in bringing exactly these mirror cases in all the other jurisdictions that they need to be brought, which just kind of builds. I think, as you say, we know that sort of more than half the revenue is outside of the US, and that will now get picked up, I think, in all of the other regulatory bodies. It's easy just to cut and paste this decision and say, well, do we have compelling evidence that in our market this is different? And I think categorically the answer is going to be no in any jurisdiction that they operate in. I cannot think of a market, you may be able to, but I can't think of a market where they would apply the tests that have been applied in this case and get a different answer.
No, 100%. And that's what all the regulators and all the other countries are saying. Look, you fought the case for us. That's great. They quote the case, We've also got a $5 billion class action for damages against Google started in the UK, I saw. We've also got 20 billion already that I'm involved in Canada, here in Australia. I would imagine every single country in the world will now join that charabanc. Here's a question for you. Do you reckon that Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, is Googling, where can I find another fucking job?
He's on Bing. He's on Bing.
I think
he's seen the future.
Is that what it is? Yeah. I think there's a very, 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 very small likelihood that he's still in a job. I think, look, it goes back to your question about appeals, right? So you bring the appeal. You have to go through the appeal because you have to be seen to be doing the right thing on behalf of your shareholders. The appeal's going to get laughed out of court. He has no place after that. Now, I did actually note the other day that Sergey Brin, the founder, is back at Google. So there was a little kind of nugget sitting in one of the Google friendly, I read those, one of the Google friendly publishers, and it was just basically saying he's back. He's helping out with AI. He's really interested. It's a real thing he wants to do. You can't imagine anything you'd rather do, which is a shame because he's not on his island in Fiji, but it does mean that he can now pop back in the office and do some work. So Pichai is toast, right? And so I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the company try to retain some of its investments and value by saying, well, look, the OG is back. He's going to do some cool stuff, and look at this cool stuff we're now going to build with AI. And I'm sure he's not there by choice. I'm sure he's there just because he has to protect the parent, the business. But I think Sundar's off.
Well, you'd think there has to be. It's such a catastrophic kind of structural loss for them, isn't it? And I think the question, actually, go back to the question about conduct, is that from an executive perspective, it's pretty damning. Those couple of paragraphs about the conduct of how this has been approached. So not only have they approached it in a way that they've actually Lionel Richie'd it and lost 3 times, but they've done it in a way that.
Do you want to sing it again?
I actually do, but I'm not
going to. Twice,
3 times.
3 times a monopoly. Yeah.
So they're going to lose on that front, but also the conduct and the questions about the kind of governance of that conduct and how they've gone about it. You would think that there has to be someone has to be held to account for that.
Again, though, what else was he meant to do? If he'd said 2 quarters ago, I've decided to rein down our monopolistic practices because I think that we're going to be antitrusted. Oh, by the way, our growth was only 1.2%. He's fired then, right? So he's either fired then or he's fired now. I think this was a plank. This is a plank. There's no way off it.
Do you think? I can't think in history of someone who got themselves into a very lucrative monopoly position and had a moment of clarity. And effectively changed the business model to encourage competition. I'm not sure it's happened in business history that I can think of.
I'd be willing to bet that that's never happened.
That's why antitrust exists.
It does.
For that reason.
This is a perfect pivot to Meta, isn't it?
Yeah.
So for everybody that might or might not be following it, we are 1 week in to Meta's antitrust trial. So, for any of you actually looking at, I can see who's on the line. I don't think any of you were in the naysayers camp that I've been sat in for the last ever, where people have just gone, never going to happen. They'll never be broken up. They'll never be trusted. It's clearly going to happen. They're all going to have it. So Meta is up. Meta is facing the very start of a trial. Now, everybody wants to try Meta for all the harm that it does. And it's got a trial on that coming, but it's not until the end of the year. So we have to wait for that one. But what they're going to do first is go after the business practices, to go after the monopoly. And the real story here is, and it's been quite good fun. I don't know how closely you've been following. Have you been following it closely?
Yeah. Can't resist it.
So, yeah, I can't either. It's just like such good viewing. So basically, the argument is that in kind of the mid 2010s, Meta, or Facebook as it was then, was kind of losing its mojo. It had done really, really well with social networking. It was about 150 million users. It's now 3.5 billion. It was 150 odd million users, highly profitable, doing very, very well indeed. But the world was pivoting to mobile, and it was utterly failing. And it was throwing money and staff and resources and sending angry midnight emails. They've all been out in the court and just could not get it to move. And so eventually he just lost his rag. Zuckerberg lost his rag and just sent a note to his staff and just said, well, what should I buy? You know, I could buy Instagram, I could buy this, I could buy that. I think I'm going to pay $500 million. No, make it $1 billion. And Sheryl Sandberg, his 2IC, was like, that's crazy. You're right, EMI. And he did. He bought it, right? So he buys this really, really fast-growing company, which was threatening to become a competitor. He then follows it up not very long after by spending $19 billion on buying WhatsApp. And that kind of created a flywheel for the business. And what's been really interesting, because I love to take these really complicated business stories and break them down into really simple things. The fact of the matter is that in Meta today, 50% of the revenue comes from Instagram and 2/3 of the audience comes from WhatsApp. So what would Facebook be without those two acquisitions? Like not a lot. Would it have continued to grow? Yeah, probably. But what would have happened to those others? And so we've been in there hearing from Zuckerberg himself talking about how he was really scared of what was happening, and that without him, Instagram and WhatsApp wouldn't be the businesses they are, and that actually by buying them, he wasn't killing competitors. What he was doing was taking fledgling opportunities and turning them into something with his genius. So it's not anti-competitive, it's pro-competitive. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Oh, by the way, I banked $164.5 billion. Jazz hands. But that was the case. That's kind of a really quick upshot of 4 or 5 days of evidence.
Yeah, I liked. I think my favourite line from that was because you know he can be. He is not by any means the most kind of empathetic communicator. And whenever he gets on the stand and he gets a bit sweaty and he gives these kind of really kind of robotic answers. But my favourite one was they said to him, you know, don't you think a reasonable person could conclude that this was kind of, I can't remember the exact question, but it was like, this is anti-competitive. He just sort of looked straight up and said, I don't think I know what a reasonable person would think.
So I got a lot of laughter and claps from the newsletter audience when I published the "Computer Says No" video in the top of my post. It was like, this is like, it's really long and complicated and serious question about the ethics and the appropriateness of its behavior, and it just gets. Computer says no.
Yeah, no.
That was what we got back, right? And it was like, And today we had Cheryl today. So Cheryl's turned up and she's lent in and she's been really friendly with the, you know, and very jokey and chatty and everything else. Now I've got a prediction for you. You asked me earlier on what do I think is going to happen with the Google appeals. I think they'll start to spin bits off. The appeal will happen because they have to, but they've kind of given up. I think they know this is an inevitability, right? I've got a prediction for you on the Meta trial. So I thought it might have happened today, but it didn't. So let's wait. Cheryl and Zuck are no longer friends. Okay, let's just put it like that. Someone had to go under the bus for Cambridge Analytica, and Sheryl Sandberg went under the bus, right? Protect the captain, save Caesar. He actually thinks he's Caesar, so that's save Caesar was the kind of strategy. And so they dumped her, and so she went into court today. And I thought, oh, she could drop one in here. She could just drop a line in here. And I was watching really closely for it, and she didn't. And I'm friends with one of the lawyers in the court case, and I asked him today why that why that didn't happen. And he said she's got nothing to gain from doing it today. Like, it's just like, all she would have done is just brought huge amounts of focus on her. He's got all the pressure on him. She doesn't need
Yeah.
that right now. She won't. And I said, but she won't do it today. Should I read today? Is today the operative word? He was like, well, she's not happy. And I'm like, So I think there's that there is a simmering tension there. And I don't think you go and kick Caesar while he's up, but you might go and give Caesar a bit of a kick if he's down. And so
Yeah.
I wonder if with the other court case coming up and the personal harms and the fact that Cheryl's a woman and a mother and everything else, my prediction is fireworks.
It'd be interesting. So I think that I have to say, I'm a little more bearish on this case than I thought I'd be, because having looked at the kind of opening arguments and what they actually need to prove, there's two things in this I think we should be a little bit cautious about. The first one is that all of this market definition question about personal social networking, which is as ever, what is the market that we are deemed to kind of have a monopoly in? That's one thing. And there's a lot of technical detail, and that we haven't seen all the economists yet, but I'm sure we shall. Talking about the different things and the kind of interplay between different platforms, and whether there's more competition now than there was 10 years ago, and therefore surely that shows that anybody can enter the market, etc. So there's a kind of technical bit that isn't a slam dunk, and then the second part is, even if you get to the end and you say, okay, yes, you have kind of through these acquisitions developed a monopoly position, there is a kind of legal precedent question, which is, can you unwind an acquisition 10 years later or longer than that on the basis that information that could not have been known at the point that acquisition went through now turns out to have created a monopoly? Mm-hmm. And can you actually unwind an acquisition? So there's one thing. So if you take the contrast of the two different cases, sorry, this is a bit technical, but if you take the contrast of the two different cases, Google is essentially, what they're saying is the product that Google has become will need to be structurally changed. But what they're not saying is you cannot have bought DoubleClick in 2007. You need to go back and unwind that. Yeah. The equivalent with Google would be something like going back and saying you can't acquire DeepMind. And so we need to go and break that apart. So Facebook essentially became, linked to Instagram, became linked to WhatsApp. There's still three sort of family entities, but all of the advertising has been kind of merged in the middle. So there's a question in this, even if the kind of thing concludes that there is a market for personal social networking and that Meta therefore has a monopoly position in it.
Yeah.
Will there be a kind of retrospective structural remedy that unwinds acquisitions? Because that sets a precedent. If you just lift that sentence and apply it to every other piece of merger and acquisitions that's happened in the last 10 years, where essentially it's turned out to be a good acquisition and market share's grown. Do you see what I mean? There's a slight kind of, I have a tremor about that. I think that I'm not sure how that works.
Your tremor is because you really want them to be broken up and you really want them to lose. So the interesting thing is that
actually, sorry, to go back to that one, I'm not.
Yeah.
So I think on Google, I kind of see there is no other option but change to that double-sided market position is untenable, right? There's no way that you can do it without structural remedy. I think the question with Meta is, if you were to separate, Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp into three separate entities, the extent to which that would make the world a better place, or create fairer markets, or kind of benefit. I mean, my particular interest is, does it create kind of better incentives for publishers to invest in the long term kind of health of information and all the rest of that? It's less obvious how that would work.
I completely concur. But going back to our earlier point, when everybody rang me and said to me, "There's no way that Google's going to get broken up because of the White House," you can use the same argument here. So if the argument is what the White House was saying today about freedom of speech and the ability to control the narrative, which we've seen again and again, that suddenly gives you a justification to break up Meta. So you might actually find that, controlling the narrative might be part. It's much easier to control speech from a very, very small or a much, much smaller company than it is one the size of Meta. Or maybe that's why Zuckerberg changed his tune so quickly on content moderators.
Possibly, but I still would go back and say, I absolutely agree with the kind of premise. I absolutely agree that there is a question about the extent to which do you really want a careless algorithmic editor defining the kind of access to information? Probably not. But this case is about whether the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp should be undone to facilitate changes to that. And that's so I just think it's like it might be that we all kind of want the outcome, but the antitrust guys are, there's a lot of economists in the room, and economists are notorious for kind of saying, well, that's like, I understand, frankly, it's very difficult to measure democratic disintegration and societal harm, but we do have a bunch of models for competitive market tensions and all this kind of stuff. So we'll see how whether the logic of the case ends up with the outcome that I think people want. And it may be that you can't get it here, but it has to come in the later sort of investigations into, what they've done with the Chinese market, or what they've done around teenage girls, or what they've done around targeting, postpartum pregnant women, or that kind of area may be where that other part happens.
And supporting the Chinese the Red Army. Was that a problem? Kind of I can't remember. Yeah, I think we talked about that last week. So my friend in the court said something very interesting to me this morning when we were chatting. He basically said, look, at the end of the day, you can't miss the fact that that the risk of remedies becomes a remedy in its own right. And so if the case had not been brought, Meta would have bought TikTok by now. So you would have created an even bigger monopoly. So the fact that it was already under FTC investigation and scrutiny meant it was completely impossible for Meta to try and buy TikTok. And so in many ways, perhaps the case has already been won by the fact that didn't happen. But I'm actually much more bullish on this. I actually think that the FTC has slow rolled into the case, whereas the DOJ went in hard, went in boots first. This has been quite slow. You've got a very charismatic and very cool lawyer acting for Meta. You've got a guy with pens in his pocket who's a little bit careful and staid and looks a bit like Beaker, kind of running the FTC. You remember Beaker from the Sesame Street?
Yeah.
That's him, is running the case for the FTC. And the judge in the case, Jeff Boasberg, actually used to work for the law firm that Meta's lead lawyer is from. And so, there's a lot of interesting subtext to all of this. But I think the FTC has stuff up its sleeve. I think when it gets to the actual economics of this, even if you do roll in all of the other social networks, if you do roll in WhatsApp and you do roll in and LinkedIn and everything else, Meta's still got 65%. I haven't actually got the FTC's number, but it's in the 60s. It's somewhere between 60 and 65. Graham's on the call; he might know the number off the top of his head. But that is still enough in previous historic antitrust cases to argue that that's a monopoly. So you don't necessarily have to prove that it's 80, 85 or 90 because it only includes those tiny ones. If you let it go to the bigger one, it's still up there.
Yeah. I'm laughing actually. At one point when I was at Bauer, we looked at buying we had to sort of take a break. And we looked at we were looking at buying one of the mags from Hearst that was in the real life category. And it would have taken us to 60% market share of the real life print magazine category in the UK, medium price range. And the advice that we got from the lawyers was, don't go anywhere near this. This is definitely going to go to a phase 2 competition regulation inquiry. It's going to cost you £1 million in lawyers' fees, And so I think at the time the advice was basically walk away. You cannot hold that kind of dominant position in the mid-range real life print magazine sector in the UK. So 60% is a threshold that is enough.
Yeah. Do you know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of a story. When I was working in the tabloids in London, we had a really, really good Sunday League football team. We were really good. And
Mm.
a Brazilian footballer from the 80s called Socrates was living in South London by chance. And we were playing in a five-a-side tournament. We ended up playing against Socrates. And we were super, super excited about this, okay?
Yeah.
And so we all decided that we wanted to play more international football. So we did some research, and one of the guys in the office came back to us and said, if we all move to Guam, okay, we'll definitely get in the national team. And in the World Cup qualifiers, we might end up playing Paraguay or something.
Yeah.
And so this was the idea. It feels a bit like that with your That's Life magazine.
Yeah.
You know, I absolutely have monopolised the under 75 kilo snowshoe 50-mile jog category. Yeah, that's very different to social media for the entire world and 164 billion dollars.
So the equivalent, going back to the Meta case, linking those two things together, the equivalent that Meta's trying to argue is, I would argue at the time, we effectively, this market is both print and digital. It's about effectively, real life stories, and that's the Sun, that's everything, blah, blah, blah. It's a bigger market than you are trying to define it as. And the answer from the law is like you're probably going to lose that, because the economists will say, where does the pricing impact create harm? There is also a lot of, in this case, about all of these products are free to the customer. So where is the harm? And they'll have to try and show there's a kind of privacy harm, there is a kind of data collection harm, there's a sort of so that's one that they've struggled with, I think, consistently. So yeah, we'll keep watching this, but it is very enjoyable to see everybody on the stand. We hope that as I don't know who else we're going to get, but as we get the kind of product teams, Adam Mosseri is going to be on, isn't he? With some...
Yeah, and he's fascinating. So his entire career is resting not so much on this trial, but on the next one. So that attack on privacy and spying on children and the state's attack, that goes straight to him. He's named all the way through the evidence bundle on that, and that's going to be really, really tough for him. But Kevin Systrom, who was the original founder of Instagram, who fell out famously with Zuck, he's giving evidence as well. So not everybody that's getting up is a kind of one of Zuck, Team Zuck. There are some people up there that have some very negative views on what's actually happened and what's been done.
Well, and you mentioned this before, that when you ask Kevin Systrom, when they will ask him on the stand, did you sell because you wanted to be part of Meta and you hope to get some cost efficiencies from the economies of scale available to you there? Or did you sell because you thought that they would crush you otherwise? We know what he's going to say.
Yeah, and he also says in the evidence bundle, like in his deposition, he was like, how much are you going to pay me for this? Like, this is twice our current valuation. That's probably going to be a hell yes, right? And so, amazing. Well, look, we're only a week into the Meta trial, and we're going to have a million different views. It's listed for 6 weeks, although I'm being told by my friends in the court that it's already overrunning, so they think it's going to run over a little bit more. They've got another week set aside for it to continue. It's going to change everything, right? So, the entire advertising market of the world is $1.2 trillion or so. We've got 350 billion wrapped up in Google, which is about to blow up. It's like Fort Knox is going to pieces. 164 sitting in Meta. That's now half a trillion dollars in advertising just there. That's more than enough to resustain the publishing industry. And if the publishing industry was even able to secure 3 or 4% of that, it would return publishing to its earnings in 2000.
Yeah.
Paul's on the line. Paul Hood, you're on the line. Think about that, mate. You left at exactly the wrong point. You should get back there.
This is exactly the point at which we should also say on TikTok Watch. I still say it will not be sold. It will have to be closed down. It's just been left at the moment. So we're still in a position in the US where there's 10 billion of advertising revenue in TikTok that is kind of in this position where it's sort of has to be closed down, but no one's quite made that step yet. There's no way a deal gets done, because there's absolutely no way at this point the Chinese government would allow that to happen, given the relationship between the two countries on all other fronts. So this is a bit like, if you thought about this is like if you imagine 4 of the 5 big supermarkets all being in kind of complete regulatory change mode, and the entire future of retail is up for grabs. It's exactly like that. So we really look forward, I think, to kind of working with everybody to think about what opportunities does this create? Because this is the opportunity of a generation.
It is. So what you're telling me, my shorthand version of what you've just said, is that Facebook's in China and TikTok's in America. Yeah?
Yeah.
That's what's happening, right? The world has truly gone mad. Look, I love these chats. I could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, but I'm sure you've all got stuff to do. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be back again same time next week. We'll be going on the road shortly. We'll give you some details about that. We're going on a world tour, aren't we, mate?
We are, yeah. I know.
Have you got your flip flops in your by popular demand?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you got flip flops and suntan lotion?
Don't leave people with that image. That's not right.
Yeah. We should do it from deck chairs somewhere. People would love that. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Really, really appreciate the support. Keep reading, and we'll chat later. Thanks, Graham.
Have a good break. Thanks, guys.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye, guys.